Okay, so today we're scheduled to talk about a biblical theology of church finances, I believe, and transparency and offerings and records. So I will hopefully help you learn how to think about those topics and provide some practical guidance. All right, so I've talked to you about a biblical theology of personal finances. I've talked to you about a biblical theology of pastoral finances. And now we want to apply those two topics to the area of the church. So, the church is the body of believers gathered for mutual edification through the word and worship and the means of the traditional way of saying that is the proper use of the means of grace. Word, the worship, communion, so on, all of those are means of grace. So when I say church, I mean a local body of believers for those purposes. A church may be incorporated or not incorporated legally. Okay, so let me just go ahead and write here a definition of the church. A group of believers meeting to build one another, build up one another through the means of grace. So the word, worship, communion, baptism, etc., prayer, so on. Okay? Legally, you can be incorporated or not incorporated. Okay, so what is incorporation? Let's just pull a dictionary definition. I could make up my own, but let's see what we've got here. Incorporation definition. Okay, this is what we want. The process of constituting a company, a city, or other organization as a legal, I would say, entity. Okay, so the process of constituting something, an organization, as a legal entity. So what this means is that here's what happened. In the United States, or perhaps in history, how do you bring a group of people, how do you bring a lawsuit against a group of people? Do every one of those individuals have the same liability? Do you have to sue every one of them individually? What do you do with a business that has 500 employees? Okay? That maybe the CEO makes decisions for, but he's not the only one who makes decisions for. Do you sue the CEO to get at the company's funds? Do you sue the board of the business? Right? So there's all these complications. So in order to get around those complications, what we did is we made a person out of a business or out of a group. And we call that incorporation. We will treat this group of people as a single entity, and so that single entity can show up in front of the law and be held liable. And that entity, that incorporation, then can own property, it can therefore be liable to the penalties of the law that get brought. Okay, so if a church is incorporated, they have gone through the legal process of making sure that no individual in the church can be sued for the property of the church, for the debts or liabilities of the church. The church as an entity holds those responsibilities. All right. So, a recent example of this. The church that my brother attends wanted to sell their property and wanted to purchase a new church. They were going to need to borrow about $250,000 to do that. Okay? Now, trustees, are you familiar with the term trustee? Trustees are usually individuals, so we'll get a definition of trustee here. So that, yeah, that's what I was going to say. An individual person or member of a board given controls or powers of administration of a property in trust. Okay, so let's entrust with a legal obligation to administer it solely for the purposes specified. Now, if a church is not incorporated, then it's the trustees who sign on the loan, and they're making themselves liable for the payment of that loan. Okay? If the church is incorporated, the trustees represent the incorporation but are not personally liable for the corporation's debts. Right? So you can imagine, as somebody who was being asked to be a trustee, that my brother would like to know, is the church incorporated or is the church not incorporated? Because if it's not incorporated, then I would be placing my own assets on the line. Are you with me? Okay. So, now, I'm sure that it's possible that different states have different laws about how corporations are formed, who's liable, and so on. So I'm giving you the general principle here, and you would want to check out in your individual state how these laws relate there. Okay? So I'm going to assume for the purposes of this lecture that the church is incorporated, that it's operating as a legal entity in the eyes of the law. And thus, I want to treat its biblical obligations as though it's an individual entity. Okay? So that's my first point, is that the wicked borrows and pays not again. Okay? So just like you as a person have an obligation to pay your debts, so the church has an obligation to pay its debts. For the church to borrow money and then default on that is wicked. Okay. What passage of Scripture says that? I'll pull it up here. Psalm 37:21. The wicked borrows and does not pay back. Okay? Now, do you remember that when we studied the Old Testament tithing system, that all the tithes of the Israelites in general went to whom? And when the tithes went to the central sanctuary as opposed to the local storehouse, who got those central sanctuary tithes? The Levites. Yes. And what did the Levites do? They took care of the tabernacle. Yes. They transported its furniture, they maintained its property, and so on. What did the Levites do with the tithes they received in terms of tithing? Okay, they paid tithes then to the priests, right? Okay. And the priest then lived off the tithe of the tithe. All right. So, if we think of the local church as a central sanctuary, okay, the money that comes in, clearly some of it goes to support the pastor, and that's part of the church's responsibility. Okay. And it may be, given the size of the church, that a vast majority of it goes to support the pastor and to pay the upkeep of the building. That would be like the Levites who keep care of the building, the upkeep of the building. All right. But it seems to me that there's a principle here that is worth considering. That is, why might not the church want to also give some of its money to something like missions? Okay. What if it tithed the church's income to missions? Now, I'm not saying that the Bible requires this, but I do believe that just as the individual Israelite had to care about the poor and the needy on years, the off years, and take their tithes and stick it in the local storehouse for the widow, the orphan, the resident alien, and the Levites who lived in their area, that it makes good sense for the church to think not simply about itself, but also about others. Okay? So, I'm thinking in terms of giving to missions, as well as giving to help the needy. That a church should... I've been in situations where the idea that the church leadership had was that giving to the needy and giving to missions was the job of the individual, not the job of the central sanctuary. Okay. Now, if in fact the church would teach that every other year you give all your annual tithes to the needy, then I would be fine seeing that we're leaving that off on the individual. Okay? But since the churches in general teach to bring your tithes always into the local, okay, then it seems like the church has absorbed some of the responsibility for caring for the needy and taking care of, thus, missions. It could either be listed under the needy or under ministry. Okay. So I want to encourage you as future pastors to look to adopt a philosophy that says, as a group of people, we want to be missions-minded. We want to be local missions-minded, but we also want to be distance missions-minded. We want to care about the spread of the gospel, not just at home, but abroad. Okay, what would be my basis for thinking of having that kind of a approach? Well, biblically, I see that Paul encouraged the Galatians and the Corinthians to give to the needs of the church in Jerusalem. So that's not just local needs that are being met, that's also distant needs that are being met. I see that Paul encouraged them to, he commends the Philippians for their support of his missionary ministry. Okay, Paul was not in Philippi. He was not ministering there. But he was in Rome receiving offerings from them. He was in Corinth receiving offerings from them. So, let me write down some references here to support what I'm saying. Philippians chapter 4, verse what? I'll start at 11 and take a look. Okay, you yourselves know, verse 15, that at the first preaching of the gospel, after I left Macedonia, okay, that's the area where Philippi is, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving but you alone. For even in Thessalonica you sent a gift more than once for my needs. Okay, so, and then God says, and my God will supply all your needs according to his riches and glory. So, I know that people quote Philippians 4:19 as though it's an individual promise given to every individual believer. But in context, Paul's talking to a group of people who had been giving to missions sacrificially. And it's to that group of people then that he says, my God will supply your needs according to his riches and glory. All right? Oh, context. What an idea. Philippians 4:15 through 19. Okay. Let's see if I can come up with some cross-references that will help us on this. Look at, here's 2 Corinthians 11:8. I have robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. Talking to the Corinthians. Okay, so 2 Corinthians 11:8. The robbed part, he's being sarcastic about the robbing. Let's do 8 through 9 here. Because in verse 11, verse 9, when he says, when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need. And in everything I kept myself from being a burden to you. So the Philippians probably, again, were not just supporting Paul when he went to Thessalonica, but also when he went to Corinth. Okay, so you see this ongoing ministry of giving to missions. How about giving to the needy? Well, that shows up in 2 Corinthians, Romans 15:26. That's a great passage. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. Give to the needy both locally and abroad. And abroad, we can write down Romans 15:26. And 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. 2 Corinthians 8 through 9. We're going to look at that passage in more depth. As far as giving to the needy locally, we can put here Acts chapter 6. You remember the story in Acts 6 where there were Hellenistic Greek widows weren't getting fed just like the Jewish widows were. And so they appointed deacons to make sure that the widows got fed. Okay, Acts 6. What other biblical New Testament data on meeting local needs? Galatians says, do good to all men, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Galatians 6, what, 10? I don't remember. Bullseye! Galatians 6:10. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who are of the household of faith. Okay? Okay, obviously, it's the church's responsibility to provide for ministers. We saw that in 1 Timothy 5, 17 to 18. And the other passages of Scripture. Okay. Taking care of property, as Levites did, would, it would make sense for the church to pray for its own property maintenance. Okay, let's think for a minute about savings. In a church context. Okay? I've heard of churches that had hundreds of thousands of dollars in savings. Okay? And then we ask ourselves, okay, what is the purpose of having hundreds of thousands of dollars in a savings account for a church, or having any amount of money in a savings account? Well, I think we can think of a couple reasons why you might want savings. Okay? We can have savings for a bumper fund, which equals a cushion when giving drops, so you can still pay your bills. Okay, are you familiar with the term bumper fund? I have bummer. I meant bumper. Okay, not a bummer fund, a bumper fund. Okay. So, this is what David Ramsey calls your emergency fund. Okay, it can also be called a bumper fund. It's providing for. So, the church that I attend had 2 air conditioning compressors go out at the same time. Well, if it's in the summer and you don't have AC, guess what people are going to quit doing? They're going to quit coming. All right? If you don't have air moving through the building, there's no way to circulate air. So the church is going to have to lay out $5,000 to $10,000. Having an emergency or bumper fund is a smart move. Okay. I would suggest that this emergency fund or bumper fund be designated by the board. I would also recommend that the church board create policies that govern how it's spent and how it gets rebuilt once spent. Okay? So what are the priorities of the church in relation to rebuilding its emergency fund? Okay, we just laid out $10,000. What's our plan for getting that $10,000 back into the emergency fund? Okay. Most churches also have a building fund. Okay. Now let me just pause and talk about this. Church buildings started to be created around the 200s AD. Okay? For the first 150 years, give or take a little, churches met in homes. Churches didn't own property. Individuals owned property. Okay. So what are the potential benefits to not having church property? Okay. Yeah. No electricity, water, property tax, which currently most churches do not have to pay property taxes, but there are people actively working in government to require churches to pay property taxes. And if churches had to pay property taxes, most of them would go out of business. Okay. Because churches often sit on prime real estate, in cities, and don't have that much money, much cash inflow to be able to pay for those kind of taxes. So you get away from property taxes. Okay, in the Roman Empire, churches got no special consideration. Wasn't until Constantine that they started getting that kind of consideration. No electricity, no water, no property taxes. No maintenance or upkeep. Yeah, no maintenance or upkeep. Maintenance costs, same thing. Maintenance costs. How about greater giving capacity? Okay, so if the church doesn't have to pay property bills, could it pay the pastor more? Yeah, it could probably pay the pastor more. Okay, so greater giving capacity to the pastor, to missions, to the poor, the needy, etc. Okay. Not only is there no electricity, water, property, maintenance costs, what about furnishings? No furnishing costs. Piano, organ, baptistry, stained glass windows, nice pews. Okay. Okay, greater sense of community, greater opportunity for individual use of gifts. Which one of you has walked into a church to go to church, except for deputation services, because you wanted to, and you'd never been inside the building before? Okay? You're going into a church that you've never been in, just to experience what's going on inside there. How many have done that? Just two? Okay, and you've gone in deputation and felt a little bit of apprehension about are these people snake handlers? Are they are they weirdos? What do these people do in that building? All right. Now, if that's true for us who are Christians, how much more true is that for somebody who's a sinner? What did they do in that building behind closed doors? Okay. Now, when air conditioning wasn't available, that was less of a problem because the church had its windows open and passerbys could hear what they did inside that building. They could hear them praying, hear them shouting, hear them preaching, whatever. Okay. But with the advent of air conditioning, that transparency disappeared. Now, if you invite somebody to come over to your house, there's a degree of apprehension about going to a new house, but it's nowhere near as much as going to a building that you have no idea what goes on inside there. Right? Houses have living rooms, kitchens, refrigerators, bathrooms. So I think there's a greater sense of accessibility. So, now let's talk about what are the benefits of having property. Benefits of traditional church property approach. Okay, a fixed place to meet. More people can gather and be ministered to simultaneously. You know, so if we're not meeting in a house, but we're meeting in some other building, then we don't get to control our access, our time of meeting, and so on. Yeah, fixed place. Let's just say fixed place and time to meet. Accessible during more of the week. We meet in somebody's house. You know, that's their house at the other times. Okay. Okay. It gives a public face to a ministry. Now, the question is, how did people in the first century have a public face to their ministry? What was the face of the church in Corinth? Okay, they may have preached in the streets, in the synagogues, in the hall of Tyrannus, but the face was the face of the people. Okay? So the public face was not a structure or not even a representative of the people, but the people themselves. I think so. You know, there's a public face to a ministry, visibility. Now, when communism took over Russia, who benefited from the visibility of the churches? Right? So when you have a government that's hostile to the church, visibility is not a positive thing. Okay? In China, you know, that's been an issue. In Russia, what happened is the church went underground. They went back to house church meetings. They went back to meetings in forests and parks and various places. And, you know, the question is, should we view that as something to be greatly lamented? Perhaps not. Perhaps it was actually to the benefit of the church that they got kicked out of their locations. So, here's my philosophy. I would like to encourage you, gentlemen, to be a both and, not either or thinkers. Okay? There are benefits from large groups of people gathering. Why do we have IHC once a year? Well, people get encouraged by seeing hundreds, maybe thousands of other people of similar faith and practice say, oh, I'm not alone. All right. There's opportunity for better quality of gifts to minister broadly. Right? So, you know, your local pianist may be octave, chord, chord, octave, chord, chord. That's the best that can be done there. And then we get, you know, IHC, awesome pianists, and we enjoy that. But would IHC happening every week actually be a good thing? No, I think it would be a bad thing. Okay? So, what would happen if we thought of ways to implement both dimensions of these ways of facilitating the body so that we had both house churches and some kind of corporate gathering. Maybe we met, we imagine something like this. You meet once on Sunday, and then you meet in a house group at another time, Sunday evening or another day during the week. Or maybe even reduce the gathering. So, how many conferences do we hear about who have 3 or 4 churches that don't have pastors? But what if those people would meet in houses and have a circuit riding pastor who each of them contributed to the support of that circuit riding pastor, and then their local gifts could be used as well. In the meantime, this is what Methodism did in the United States. Methodism set up these class meetings and had a class leader, and every person in the class meeting could contribute, bring a song, bring a psalm, bring a word of testimony, a word of exhortation. Okay, they could bring unbelievers to the class meeting, and they could be evangelized there. And then, every once in a while, the circuit riding preacher would come along, and then you'd have somebody who was specifically preaching the word. Okay? Now, this way of thinking threatens the current way of thinking. And but my response is it does not have to threaten a pastor of a local church, particularly if the church is growing. Because what do megachurches tend to do? Megachurches tend to have one service and then multiple small groups that do this, right? So the larger a church in a given locale becomes, the more it makes sense to distribute the church. So I know multiple holiness churches that have people driving an hour, 30, 40 hour longer, 2 hours to attend that church. And so they bypass all this territory in between, and there's no outreach in their particular locale. What if we pushed the people back out to the locale and say, everybody who's driving from a distance is going to start a church in their locale, in their home, and we'll do what 1 Corinthians 14 says. We'll have word of prophecy, we'll have a song, a hymn. If somebody has tongues, fine, they have to have an interpreter. Okay? We'll make use of all of the gifts. People who have the gift of hospitality can then actually use that in that context. Okay? And you invite your sinner neighbors to come, just like they were doing in Corinth. And even though the meeting is not about gospel preaching, that's not the point of the gathered church. Okay? And let me just pause right here and say that at no point in the New Testament do we find the Holy Spirit saying, you gather together to be a lighthouse so that sinners can come to the church and get saved. Okay? In fact, the lighthouse metaphor itself is relatively recent in time, okay, for the church. All right? No. The church was for the believers to edify one another so that as they went back out, they would then be sharing the gospel in their place of work, in their shopping, in their daily life. Right? And occasionally they would bring friends into the worship. Unbelievers would come in. But even there, Paul says, how will unbelievers get saved? You know this, 1 Corinthians 14? Am I saying stuff you don't know? Okay, so look at verse 23. Therefore, if the whole church assembles together, and all speak in tongues, and ungifted men or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you're mad? Okay. But if all prophesy, and an unbeliever or an ungifted man enters, he is convicted by all. He is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed, and he will fall on his face and worship God, declaring that God is certainly among you. So then, prophecy, yes, and prophesying have already been defined in this same chapter in verse 3. One who prophesies speaks to men for edification, exhortation, and consolation. So it's as we are speaking to one another in believers to encourage, to console, to build up, that a sinner hearing this encouragement, consolation, and edification then would be convicted. Isn't that interesting? Okay. Paul wasn't expecting them to say, oh, a sinner just showed up, gospel message time. No, it's in fact the very act of the church building itself up that becomes a means of drawing sinners. Okay. Let me use an illustration. It's like, which would you rather do? Take a drive in a car you're considering buying, or look at it through the show window? You want to take a drive, right? Preaching the gospel is often the show window display of the product. Watching believers interact with one another, mutually love and encourage one another, that's taking a drive in the product. All right, so I took a little pause here to think about benefits of having or not having church property. If you're talking to a pastor, somebody who's already got a vested interest in the way things run, most of them aren't overly thrilled about the idea of distributing things like this. But what I notice is pastors who pastor larger churches consistently see that they can't oversee the flock well, and they need this kind of distribution and use of the gifts. Okay? So maybe if our churches were growing like they ought to be, we'd have less resistance to this. All right, a building fund is a common form of savings. There's a danger here, and that is use of savings for security. Okay? The same approach that people have to their own personal finances can be transferred into church finances where the church needs security. Okay? Now, preparation for an emergency, that makes good sense. Okay? But here's my question. If there aren't enough people coming to the church to pay for the property, why do you need the church? Okay, so this is where the standard model takes on a life of its own. Right? It's no longer about meeting the needs of the people. It's about the people meeting the needs of the property. Okay? But somehow we've got it on our mind that it's a horrible thing to sell church property. It's a horrible thing to close a church. It doesn't have to be a horrible thing. It can mean that there isn't any church in that area. Well, think on those things.